Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. If this is your first time being on the podcast, we welcome you to the show, and we hope that you enjoy tonight's episode. For those who are returning, we welcome you back, and we hope that tonight's episode is insightful and informative for you. So before we introduce our next guest for tonight, I want to just go over a few housekeeping items real quickly. First and foremost, holiday season is here, so we do have some Identity Talk apparel swag that we're going to be putting up for sale for any of people who want to get some new hoodies, new t-shirts to get started for the new year. So that's going to be on sale very soon. So be on the lookout for that. You can visit our shop on the Teespring website at teespring.com, and URL is right there. And then for anybody who is looking to get professional development credits, we currently have our Identity Talk School where you can apply for any of these two classes. So we have our Shape the Teacher Identity 101 class, which is for any teachers who want to shape their identities and to gain more insight as to how they can have more success in the classroom. So to learn more about that, you can visit our website and book an appointment at calendly.com/Identity Talk for Educators. And then same thing for our spell program for anybody who wants to learn how to self-publish a book and everything there is to know about the self-publishing process. So if you're interested in any of those offerings, make sure you reach out to us, and we'd love to hear where you are on your journey and how we can support you in that. So now let's talk about tonight. So tonight, we want to stay on the subject of social justice, and I have a special guest who is doing some phenomenal work with her company, Little Justice Leaders. I actually came across her maybe a month ago on social media and just saw the work that she was doing through her company. And I just said, you know what, we got to bring you on the show to talk more about her company and all of the work she's doing and her doctoral work that she's doing right now at UCLA, among many things. So tonight's guest is an educational researcher and an avid social justice advocate. And I'm just excited to have Shelby Kretz come on the show to talk about her work. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Shelby on and we're going to start our conversation. Welcome.
Thank you. Kwame, I'm really excited to be here. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it.
Hey, I try to give everybody justice.
That was good.
So first off, I know you have a daughter. How's she been with virtual learning so far? How's that experience been for her and for yourself?
I actually don't have any kids.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. I have a niece and nephew, and actually a few nieces and nephews, and so I post about them a lot. So I think some people tend to think they're my kids, but they're not.
Well, my apologies. Well, how are they doing?
Right. They're doing really well. My nephew is he's actually in preschool, and they're still back in school now. He was out for a while. And then my other nephew is doing like a hybrid, some virtual, and then I think they're actually going back in person soon. So yeah, it's been a whole mix, and but all the kids are doing pretty well considering the circumstances. I mean, all kids have had to adapt a lot this year, so I think I'd say they're doing pretty well.
Yeah, I know it's been a difficult year for all, but we're just hoping that we can finish on a positive note.
Yep. Definitely.
So let's jump right into the conversation. So the first question that I love to ask my guest is to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what ultimately brought you into the education field.
Yeah, absolutely. As Kwame had mentioned, I am the founder of Little Justice Leaders, and I'm a graduate student in education at UCLA. I'm actually in my 5th year of my PhD program there. But what got me into education, I was majoring in psychology as an undergrad, and I actually thought I was going to go on to get a PhD in psychology was my plan and become a therapist, or a psychologist. And then I kind of stumbled upon an opportunity in college. I was having a conversation with 2 friends. One was from Kenya and one was from India. And we were just having a conversation about our different experiences as women growing up in the world, in the parts of the world that we grew up. I grew up in Ohio. And then in our experiences, as college students. And we started to talk about, well, what are we doing to support women in our community and girls? And it kind of snowballed into, well, we want to do something. Let's see what's going on with girls in our community. And we started reaching out to some summer camps and schools, and we found that there was a huge need. So we ended up creating a leadership program for girls, and it all really just snowballed. We didn't really set out to start a nonprofit, but that's what it turned into. And so in my first year out of college, I was spending a ton of time in schools and around schools, and I started to really develop a passion for education. We were working in one of the so-called lower performing middle schools in the state of Ohio. And, just seeing all of the challenges faced by the school, I started thinking kind of more structurally and systemically about like schooling and education. And that's what kind of led me to say, okay, I want to pursue this further. And so I started to look into a PhD program after that.
All right, well, nice.
Yeah.
Now, could you talk a little bit more about your nonprofit?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's important for the audience to know just the important work you're doing for young girls and young women.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like I said, I started it when I was in the end of my undergraduate career. So that was back in 2013 with my 2 co-founders. And we were really learning as we were going, but we just found that there was such a huge need. There were schools reaching out to us that we didn't even have, volunteers to fill. And so what we did is we created a leadership program that was co-created with the girl, ultimately co-created with, middle school girls and college students, as well as like education professionals to be facilitated by college students. And we did leadership programming for the college students. And then they went in and facilitated the program with the middle school girls. So it was kind of an intergenerational connection for them. And the program's still running now. It's a nonprofit. I'm not as involved as I used to be. I sit on the board, but it's kind of been taken over by, a lot of the young women who started off as volunteers, as well as, some other amazing community advocates. And that is based in Columbus, Ohio, and it's called One Girl. But since I left Columbus, I haven't, been able to stay as connected, but they are still running and doing an amazing job with the work they're doing there.
Oh, that's incredible. That's incredible. So I know tonight we are going to be talking a lot about social justice. And when we talk about this topic, a lot of people start at different points in their journeys. Some start at the very beginning. Some start a little bit later in life. So I want to get a sense from you. At what point did you catch the social justice bug? And what ultimately ignited your journey to learn more about the causes within this topic?
Yeah. So for me, I definitely did not start on this path at a young age, I wouldn't say. When I was younger, I was interested in volunteering, and I had this idea that I wanted to help people. So I kind of always had that drive. But as I got older, I started to learn more about justice work, which is obviously not synonymous with helping people, and it's not synonymous with volunteering whatsoever. But I started to get into that in high school, volunteering, because that's just what I was interested in. But once I got into college, I took a seminar on race and gender, and that was one moment that really kind of opened my eyes, to realize there were, so many things going on, so many complexities around race and gender that I didn't even realize. There were, it was kind of a series of moments for me. So there was that. There were a few high school teachers, I can count on one hand, the number, who kind of sort of mentioned anything related to justice, and I was always very interested in that, but didn't know very much. And then throughout my college career, I started to learn more and more through friends, through classes, and then ultimately through One Girl. When we started One Girl, admittedly, I was not very well versed in social justice, but I learned very quickly through the work we were doing, because I wanted to do the best I could to support the girls. And I was hearing from everyone, about not necessarily about social justice, but they weren't necessarily saying that word, but about concepts of justice. And so that's when I really started to get into it. And then ultimately, my PhD program is very centered on social justice work as well.
Right. So I know with regard to your PhD program, you're currently at UCLA.
Yep.
And you're working under the tutelage of one of the most prominent people in this movement. When we talk about education, Dr. Pedro Noguera. If people don't know about Dr. Noguera, they need to get familiar.
Right.
He is somebody who has done a lot of phenomenal work for many, many years in this movement. So please, if you could just elaborate on the scope of your research in your doctoral program at UCLA, and also what's been your experience like working under Dr. Noguera and his stewardship?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was so excited to, be accepted to this program to work specifically under Dr. Pedro Noguera. That was the primary reason why I selected UCLA over other options, because, working with him was going to provide me the greatest opportunity to be connected with someone who is such a well-known leader on this issue globally. And it has been amazing. I mean, working with him, I've learned so much. He's very down to earth, very responsive. That was, one thing a lot of people ask is like, having an advisor who is so well known, so sought after. Sometimes they tend to be a little bit, out of touch with students, but Dr. Noguera is not that way at all. I can always count on him to reply to my email within like 2 hours if I need something, and be willing to meet, within 24 hours if I need something. So he's just very down to earth, very kind person, but also just being able to, go back and forth and talk with him about research ideas and education and the education system and, like the changing, aspects of the education system and justice issues. It's been a phenomenal experience. I learned so much from him every day, and I'm so grateful to have him as an advisor. In terms of my research, what I'm working on now for my dissertation, I'm looking at the connection between the juvenile injustice system and the education system. So specifically, I'm looking at the transition from incarceration spaces back into education spaces for young people who have been incarcerated. And I'm doing this through kind of two different lenses on how it's been done. Typically, the research field hasn't looked very much at that transition because so few students actually make that transition. So many young people who are incarcerated don't end up back in school spaces at all. And there are a lot of structural and personal reasons for that. So most of the research just doesn't even consider that as a possibility. And I want to reopen that as a possibility, that young people can go back to school and get a high school education, because we know in our society the value of a high school diploma and how many more opportunities that can open for young people. The second thing I'm doing is centering the voices of young people as the experts. So a lot of the work centers, the staff who work in the juvenile injustice system, or even staff who work in education systems as experts on this topic. But really, the young people who have been through this experience of being incarcerated and then going back to school are the ones who can speak to the challenges and the opportunities are in that area. So my entire dissertation is focused on the voices of the youth. I'm not actually talking to anybody else. So that's what I'm doing for my dissertation.
So with regard to centering the experiences of our youth, because as someone who's taught middle school students, particularly those who have had some interaction with law enforcement and have gotten into, some trials and tribulations. I know for a fact that when they get caught up in those situations, it's not something that they do on purpose. It's due to certain circumstances.
Right.
And a lot of times when I have these conversations with these young men, these young ladies, they tell me that they want to do better, but there's this sense of despair.
Yeah.
So I want to know from you, how can young people, what should our criminal justice system do to help young people and really all people reintegrate into society so that they can have a fair shot at redemption?
Absolutely. So there are quite a few factors to take into account, especially for young people, but really for everyone. There are structural barriers, right? So a lot of times the school district and the juvenile system don't even connect to get transcripts passed between the system, so that even if the young person wanted to re-enroll, they couldn't, because they're waiting on the transcripts to come and all the records to come, and that can take months, and sometimes it never comes. And so structural barriers is such a huge problem that needs to be addressed. But there's also personal barriers, right? There's transportation. There's very real needs for, money, right? People need a place to live. A lot of times young people, and especially adults coming out of the system, need a place to stay, right? They need secure housing, and so they need employment, and they need transportation to get to that employment. And so there's all of these things on a young person's mind that kind of takes precedence over going back to high school. So when we're thinking about how to provide support when people are reintegrating in society, we really need to think about those tangible things like employment, financial assistance, transportation, the basic needs. And then on top of that, of course, there's healthcare, there's mental health care, there's parenting for folks who have kids and are reuniting with their kids, or if they're pregnant. There's also, peer relations, right? So how do we support young people to transition back into their community and feel safe and feel, and like they're in a place where they have a support system, but are also not transitioning back into, peer groups that might be leading them back into, incarceration. So there's all of those different things to consider. It's it's a complex system, but what we need is kind of like 360 kind of support around a young person to be able to help them reintegrate.
Right. And you mentioned a few of those different needs that our youth need. You talk about financial assistance. You talk about just trauma in general, whether it's mental, whether it's emotional, physical. And these are things that we hear about in our traditional school settings now.
Yeah.
We're hearing a lot about restorative justice. We're hearing a lot about trauma-informed practices for students who may not be in those same predicaments as those who are in the juvenile system.
Yeah.
So if we're emphasizing these practices with that population of students, I would think that it will make sense to do it for those who are in more dire situations.
Right. It would absolutely make sense. But like I said, a lot of folks just kind of give up on the idea that a young person who's been incarcerated, especially for any significant period of time, can actually return into schooling, right? So that they're really kind of often just looked at more as adults, which I think is so problematic when you're looking at, a 14 or 15-year-old child and treating them as if you would treat an adult, and not treating them like the way you would treat a kid in school, or the way you should treat a kid in school. But I think there are a lot of, really troubling parallels between our school systems and our incarceration systems, which is, maybe a whole different conversation.
Yes. And there's so much to unpack when we talk about that. So
Absolutely.
much to unpack. But I want to go ahead and talk about Little Justice Leaders, because when I came across the subscription boxes, and I want to thank you again for sending a complimentary one to me.
Yeah, of course.
I absolutely loved it.
Oh, I'm so glad.
I love the concept and the idea, particularly during a time where the learning of our youth is being interrupted by COVID-19, with a back and forth between virtual learning and in-person learning, and just the lack of consistency in that arena. To have something that's coming every single month that's going to supplement the learning of those students, I just think is very helpful. So I want to give you an opportunity to just share your inspiration behind Little Justice Leaders. What got you started, with that journey, and what's the overarching mission of this company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with our mission. Our mission is to create a generation of change makers who are going to help to dismantle oppression and fight for justice. So that's what we're hoping to do, raising little change makers. What got me into this? So around the time of the 2016 election, as everyone remembers, there were often a lot of troubling stories, comments, conversations happening on the news and in the media, and kids were seeing this, right? And so I was, at that time, I had been working in schools for a long time. I was just in the beginning of my PhD, and so I was spending a lot of time in schools doing research, and I was hearing from a lot of teachers, and I was hearing from a lot of parents that they just didn't know how to talk to their kids about the topics that were coming up on the news, and so the solution was to just not talk about it. So I thought that was that bothered me, because I thought, okay, well, the kids are getting these messages from somewhere. So, if parents and teachers aren't the ones talking about it, then, what kind of misinformation and confusion and fear might, they have if they feel like these are taboo topics that they can't talk about. So I had that in my mind, like, okay, parents and teachers are wanting to talk about these things, and they just don't know how. They don't have the tools. Which is understandable, right? They're obviously, they're busy. They can't be an expert in every topic, and they have a lot on their plate, as we know all educators and caregivers do. The second thing that was kind of solidifying in my mind at that time was, trying to make sense of my space, my place, as a white woman in education. And my PhD program specifically is in urban schooling. And so figuring out, like, what is my place in this? How do I fit into this world? And so I was starting to explore kind of like, okay, what do we see as, the problems when it comes to justice issues? And the problem, for instance, is the actual bigotry, right? It's the hatred, it's racism, it's sexism, it's homophobia. Those are the problems. And when we think about how we solve those problems, so a good example that, people talk about often is, do we teach girls or, police girls on what to wear and how to act in order to not, be assaulted, or,
right.
Right? Or do we teach and raise our boys and men to not assault women? Up until this point, obviously, we don't necessarily do it the right way. But for me, obviously the answer is, like, our role as society, our goal as society, of course, should be to provide the people with privilege with an upbringing where they don't perpetuate bigotry and hatred, as opposed to policing and silencing the people who don't have privilege in our society. So those were kind of all of the things going on in my mind at the time. And then, of course, like, my role as a white woman, and how do I bring in my community to this work, right? How do I bring other white folks into this work, or help support them in becoming anti-racist, for example, and understanding justice on a deeper level. So that was all where my head was at. It was kind of a whole bunch of things going on at once. And then it kind of occurred to me, like, oh, I could help caregivers and educators have those conversations, particularly with kids who do hold privilege, which, most kids hold privilege in some way, right? Whether that's racial privilege, gender privilege, cisgender privilege, hetero privilege, able-bodied, all of those things. Like, most kids are holding some kind of privilege. So how do we reach kids on a mass scale to educate them about the privileges they have and the injustices in the world at the same time, so they can start to see their place in it, see their place as change makers, and also start to identify the power in their identity, right? Which, a lot of times our power comes from our less privileged identities, but starting to see that power and see our ability, as activists, to speak up, and then also speak up against, the injustices against people who don't look like us. So it's kind of all of those things going on. And then I was like, oh, I think I could do something about this, and it has to be ongoing. There's no way you could package that into a one-time experience.
Wow. And I'm so glad you mentioned the part about decentering whiteness, because it's something that we hear. It's something that's been hashtag.
Yeah.
And there's some folks who use the term and the phrase, but it's questionable as to whether or not they fully understand the depth of that,
right,
and what that entails.
yeah.
So, speaking as a white woman, in what ways can white people decenter whiteness? What can they do in their own practices, regardless of what industry they're in? They don't even have to be educators, but what are some tips that you can provide? And of course, you're not speaking for all, but just through your experience, what are some things that you've been able to do to help you in that process of helping folks understand the depths of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's an ongoing practice, and this is going to be a lifelong learning journey for any white person. So, it's not one of these things where we have a checklist, but for me, like I said, I was thinking about my space in urban schooling. And urban schooling, it's the name of my program, but it's also just a code word often used to, describe spaces where Black and brown children are educated in our country. Right. And so, for me, thinking about like, okay, well, I'm a white person. Like, what is my space in this role? Like, I don't necessarily think, and this isn't to say that, no white educators, should be teaching in Black and brown spaces. But for me, I had to question, like, is the best use of my power, my privilege, my identity, who I am as a person, to be in kind of a savior role, or feeling like I'm coming in and helping, Black and brown communities, through urban schooling. And so for me, I was like, I don't think that's right necessarily. And it's not saying it's wrong for every person, but for me, it wasn't what was right. And so for me, decentering whiteness in that way was kind of pulling myself out of that situation in some ways, right? And saying, actually, I'm going to create, this company, Little Justice Leaders, that serves all kids. But really, I'm hoping it also serves very privileged kids, right? I'm hoping it serves a lot of white kids, because that's where my power is, and is, pulling in white communities in that way, and allowing, Black and brown communities to, support their own selves and solve their own problems, because that's where their power is. And that's where they have way more solutions to any problems their own community might be facing than I could ever come up with. And so for me, decentering whiteness was pulling myself out of certain spaces. And that can be the case for you, whether you're an educator or in any space, right? So when you're coming into anti-racism work and trying to learn about it, decentering whiteness looks like, knowing where you shouldn't be, right? There are certain places you don't need to be. There are certain spaces that aren't for us, and there needs to be spaces that are made for and only for people of color. So one example I have heard some people talking about lately is, conferences that are for people of color, and, of course, they're usually like open for anyone to actually attend, and white people coming in and kind of taking up a lot of space. And sometimes, like, that is not your place. Just if you want to learn about anti-racism, I promise there are a ton of resources out there. You don't need to go to a conference that's made for people of color. You especially don't need to take up space in that conference by coming in and sharing your opinions and asking your questions. So sometimes it's knowing when to pull yourself out. It's also knowing when to insert yourself, right? And that is often, if you see injustice happening, right, using your privilege to speak up against it if it's appropriate, which is always different in every situation. And then kind of another big step that I think most white people need to take is kind of a personal audit of your own, for instance, media consumption. What books are you reading? Who are the authors? Who are the characters? What movies are you watching? Who are the characters? Who are the directors? All of those types of things to really get a sense, because I think it's very easy to think like, oh, like, I'm woke, I'm this, I'm that. But when you really take stock of, what are you consuming? What are you taking in? How are you centering whiteness in your own white life, right? Who are you surrounded with? Who's in your community? All of these kinds of questions, if nothing else, will give you a more honest picture of how much whiteness is actually centered in your life.
Right. And I'm so glad that you mentioned all those different things, because when we think about decentering whiteness, part of that process, well, a huge part of that process is putting your ego to the side.
Absolutely.
And creating space for others who may not look like you to be seen.
Yes.
And what I love about Little Justice Leaders is the fact that you address the intersectionality of our identities as humans. It's not just about race. You focus on gender. You focus on cultural backgrounds. and you have a creative way of making those different components of our identity seen to others,
right,
and emphasize. So if you don't mind, I would love for you to just share maybe a few examples of what the boxes look like and what are some of the themes that you cover with the subscription boxes for the company.
Yeah, absolutely. So for what's in a box, basically every single box is going to have a book that covers the topic. And I should say every month is a box, and every month has a different theme. So like Kwame said, we try to be very intersectional, but we focus on one specific theme every month. And then we, obviously try to consider how to teach that in a way that also draws on other themes of social justice. But every box, you'll get a kid's book that talks about the issue or addresses the issue that we're talking about. You'll get a hands-on activity to do with your kids or your students. And that will be like, some kind of craft activity or game, something that they can do physically with their hands, because obviously kids love to, engage in some kind of activity while they're talking. And then a set of information cards for the adult because we know that adults aren't, going to be experts on all these topics either. I often get feedback that the adults are learning just as much as the kids are, because, we're not all experts on every single topic. And so a set of information cards for the adults to understand, like tips for them tips for them for covering it, conversation starters to talk to their learners, a whole bunch of different information depending on the topic. And then some lessons and activities, worksheets and that kind of thing for the educators, but the parents like those too. And then we always have at least one piece of activist art. So that is a piece of art that is somehow connected to the theme. It might be like hand-lettered quote. It might be a portrait of, someone who's a famous figure, person to know, or, a brilliant activist, something like that. And that would be like on a sticker, a poster, a magnet, a pin, something cute for them to have. So that's kind of what everyone can expect in a box. In terms of the types of themes we cover, for example, our December box was disabilities. We have done this year, we did voting rights and voter suppression. We did, what have we done? We did anti-racism this year in May. We did school segregation. So we were looking at historically and current modern day school segregation. We cover topics of environmental justice. We cover topics of gender, like we've done gender norms, LGBTQ plus identities, transgender identities, and religious diversity. So we actually have a box coming out in January that's going to be covering some religious diversity that I'm really excited about. So yeah, kind of a whole range on the spectrum of justice, ranging from environmental to race, gender, sexual orientation, and religion, ability. Anything that is related to justice, we will cover it.
So correct me if I'm wrong. The subscription boxes, they are specifically designed for elementary students, so grades K to 6, correct?
That's correct.
But what I love about the boxes is the fact that they're cross-curricular. So you can use them in your ELA block, you can use them in your science block, social studies, civics. So it pretty much covers all the main content areas that those students learn in school, which is what's awesome about it.
Yeah, so that's always one of our goals, is to make it, it's very adaptable. You can, and I have, like I said, we say it's for K through 6 right now. I have preschool parents and educators who subscribe. I have middle school and high school parents and educators who subscribe. We actually used to have a middle school version. We're kind of phasing that out. But I still have high school, teachers who subscribe. Because like I said, even the adults who are facilitating it are learning a ton from the box. The age range is really based on the reading level of the book that's provided, but there's so much, there's so much to be gained from learning about a different justice issue every month. And I should note, we always work with experts. So we consider an expert someone who is personally impacted by a topic, and someone who knows a lot about that and is an activist in that space. They don't necessarily have to have a formal title. So we always work with those folks to help put together the boxes, especially if it's a topic that I am not connected to. So for example, we did our disabilities box this month, and we had 3 folks. One is a college student and a Paralympic athlete. One is an educator, and one is actually one of our students, one of our Little Justice leaders who's been subscribed for the past 2 years. And all 3 of them have different disabilities, and we all came together to create the box and create an experience that made sense from their point of view. And of course, we always point out that this is still a limited point of view. Because there are as many different, opinions on disabilities as there are people with disabilities. Yep, and that's the case for every single topic. So we always say, like, this is just a start. This is one perspective. This is, what we think, and look into it and decide what you think. So it's really not about telling them, anything that's true. It's more about engaging them in critical thinking and conversation.
And I think it's amazing that you're able to release these boxes at the frequency that you're doing this. So I just want to know, just curious, about how long does it take to put together the box, all the different components of it? Yeah. I know it's a tedious process.
It's a long process, and it's we do a different box every single month. A lot of people ask, are we on like a 12-month rotation? No, it's brand new every month. So I think we just put out our 29th box. So yeah, it is a tedious process. It very much varies, especially from the beginning, because I've changed kind of how we do it a lot. But depending on how much I know about the topic, how involved the consultant who's working on that topic is, it can take anywhere from probably around, I'd say, like 10 to 20 hours to like put together kind of the curriculum and put together all of the content that's going to be included for the adults and the instructions and all that fun stuff. And then, that involves kind of like brainstorming an activity and deciding on the book. And then we have to actually order all of the supplies. So that's the books, the materials for the crafts. And that takes a little bit longer because we try to be super, cognizant of who are we ordering from, what companies are we supporting small businesses, that are, women-owned, BIPOC-owned, LGBTQ-owned, and authors. So like sometimes that can take a little more time because we're trying to be very aware of that. Although, we can't always support the businesses as much as we want to, small businesses as much as we want to, since we're still a small business. But so there's that process. And then there's, of course, the process of actually building the boxes, which takes the longest. And that, again, it's changed as we've grown. It takes a lot longer now. But now I would say the whole process from like getting the shipments to putting them all together and then shipping them out. If it's just one person doing it alone, if it was only me, it would probably be like 50 hours in a month. That would take 40 to 50 hours in the whole process. But I often have had help from family, friends, my partner. And so I'm lucky to have some help there. And very recently, as of the past 2 months, I've actually outsourced that part of the work. And so my family's actually taken that over, and I'm able to pay them to handle that. And my mom was able to retire from her job to be able to manage that side of the business.
Yeah, special shout out to the family for coming through with extra hands.
Oh, they came through for a long time for free, because it would have been a lot to do on my own.
That's a labor of love right there. Labor of love.
Absolutely.
Yes. So I have one more question before we get into the lightning round.
Yeah.
So 2020 has been a crazy year.
It has.
And we have a change in the guard, in the White House. Mm-hmm. So there is some optimism with the new administration.
Yes.
For the first time in the history of our country, we have a woman of color who's going to be taking on the vice president role. Yeah. And Kamala Harris. And then you have an educator in Dr. Jill Biden. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of talk about her lately with the article. Yeah. Regarding just her doctor distinction But
Yes.
I'm pretty sure I know how you feel about that.
Right.
It kind of just it kind of speaks to the sexism that still exists
Absolutely.
within our society.
Yes.
But nevertheless, there is a lot of optimism about her being in that seat, given the fact that in previous elections, education always seems to be on the back burner.
Yes.
In comparison to other issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just interested in hearing from you. What are your hopes and your initial thoughts with regard to this administration within the context of education?
Yeah.
And maybe to share maybe one or two issues that you would like to see the administration tackle when they get into office officially next month.
Absolutely. So yeah, education has been like historically very under kind of valued and talked about in politics, partly because there's not a very fast return on investment when it comes to education, right? We don't necessarily see the results really for, a generation.
Right.
So it's hard to, a lot of politicians just don't want that to be their primary issue. So I am very hopeful. I am very excited about, what they could potentially do, having an educator and hopefully bringing in, a really great Secretary of Education. So I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think this year actually has obviously has totally disrupted the education system,
right.
The pandemic. And so I hope that we can use this as kind of a jumping off point to say, okay, we really need to rethink education because a lot of the challenges have become very apparent this year because of the pandemic. So I'm hopeful. If there was, kind of one issue that I would love to see any administration tackle when it comes to education that I think could really move the needle would be, and this would be a very big project, but it would be school funding, kind of the school funding formula, the connection between, taxes and school funding that pretty much just provides more funding to schools that already have a lot of, funding and resources and less funding to schools that don't have a lot of funding and resources. That I think, if an administration really, I think, wanted to move the needle on education, in my opinion, we need to jump out of this whole, debate about charter schools versus public schools. It's an important issue, but we've gotten so much in the weeds of that. I think people are losing the bigger picture, which is that we're giving our highly resourced schools more resources and we're giving our less resourced schools fewer resources. And that, if we could, fix that, that would really move the needle, as opposed to this pitting traditional public schools against charter schools, which are also public schools. And it's just kind of causing this internal fight that is we're losing sight of the bigger problem, which is that the whole basis of our school funding is completely inequitable.
Right. And that's just an iteration of Jim Crow.
Absolutely.
Think about it,
absolutely.
The way that the funds are allocated between, charter schools versus public schools, even though you do have some intersection with charter schools, because there's some charter schools that are public, there's some that are private. But all right, I lied. I have another question. One more. Now, with regard to Secretary of Education, there's been talk about that as well.
Yes.
There are some folks who believe that the next Secretary of Education should be an actual K-12 educator, someone with that experience. And there have been some names that have floated around. So I want, and obviously, regardless of who's put in that seat, you still have to address the system,
right?
The actual political infrastructure.
Right.
But putting that to the side for a second, what would be your ideal candidate for that position?
Yeah. So for me, ideal would be, I would love to see someone with K-12 education experience, someone who actually has been in a classroom or otherwise worked in a school in some capacity with, students. I would also love to see, someone who's had some kind of administrative experience or potentially governmental experience, research experience with education, kind of pairing the, actual classroom work with a little more structural look at education. And I really would like to see a Black woman in that role. I think there are so many amazing Black women in education who have made, huge impact on the field. And I would love to see a Black woman in that role, because I think they bring, obviously, depending on who it is, of course, but I think a Black woman with the experience of K-12 education and some, structural education, or, some structural work, whether that's through politics or through administration, I think would really bring a perspective we need into that role.
Well said, well said. And I know the Biden administration has been very intentional about this idea of racial diversity, as well as ideological diversity, which is a term that they've pretty much been throwing out there. And they've been very meticulous, through this process. So we'll see what happens.
I am hopeful, cautiously hopeful.
Yes. Keyword cautiously.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So let's go into the lightning round. So
all right.
I have a few questions, which you already know what they are.
Yes, I'm ready.
And, you've been working hard with your doctoral studies and managing Little Justice Leaders. So I want to know from you, what is Shelby's favorite self-care activity right now? What do you do to alleviate the stress?
For me, it's reading. Always has been. I love to just sit down and get lost in a good novel.
All right, awesome. Well, let's follow that up with maybe a favorite book you're reading right now.
Oh my gosh, I'm reading a few right now. What did I'm trying to think. I usually am reading, I'm usually in the middle of 5 different books, which I am right now. Like an audiobook, an nonfiction, a business book, and a fiction novel. I'm reading the fiction novel Patsy right now. It's really good. It's a story of a young woman who comes to America from Jamaica, and just her experience as an undocumented immigrant and Black female lesbian in the U.S. It's interesting. It's a good one.
And it's called Patsy.
Patsy, and I'm halfway through it, so but so far so good.
Listen, I wish I had the ability to multitask and read multiple books at once. I'm just more of a one book at a time kind of person. So kudos to you, because
I feel like most people are just one at a time. I'm crazy. I can't stop starting books. That's my problem.
No, and also given the book choice, you already do a lot of reading with your doctoral studies. So it's actually a pleasant diversion from what you would have to read for your research. I'm imagining.
Definitely. And I will say I read a lot less when I was in the thick of it with actually taking classes, which I'm not anymore. Now I'm just doing my dissertation. So I do less reading now than I used to for school. So I will say, for any PhD students out there, if you don't have time to read, I get that. I was not reading as much when I was in my first couple of years.
Nice. So I know you are an avid traveler.
Yes.
My wife is as well.
Nice.
Yeah, as soon as I got married to her, I got my global entry card, and I've traveled to 20 plus countries.
Oh, that's so awesome.
So I caught the bug from her.
Yes.
But I want to know from you, what are 3 countries that are still on your bucket list?
Yeah. Costa Rica is a big one that I think we're going to do next as soon as we safely can. And Switzerland has gotten up there recently because I had just some signs from the universe kind of that gave me that idea, and I'm going to take it and run with it as soon as I can. And then South Africa. South Africa is another one. It's funny, actually the first night that I met my partner, we both were talking about how we wanted to go to Cape Town. And so now, of course, it's our goal to go there together as soon as we can.
Awesome. And Cape Town is a great place to visit. I've heard nothing but great things about it. I've yet to, go to South Africa, but that's something that I would like to do.
Yeah.
Definitely.
What's your favorite country, Ben? I know you're the interviewer here, but I'm so curious.
It's hard to choose. So I actually enjoy Thailand.
Okay.
Which was one of our honeymoon visits.
One of them?
Yes, we actually visited 3 countries. We
Oh,
visited
that's awesome.
Thailand, Kenya, and Tanzania,
That's so cool.
all in 1 month. And
Wow.
Thailand was great because of
Yeah.
the massages, and
Mm,
we learned so much about Buddhism. So we were we were in Bangkok, and then we were traveling to other parts within the country.
that's so cool.
But Thailand was great. We've done Malaysia as well. We visited Jakarta and Bali,
Okay, nice.
and I'm sorry, Indonesia.
Mhm.
So that was cool as well. So
Right.
there's too many favorites. It's hard to choose one.
Oh, I know how it is.
Hard.
Yes.
All right. 3 people who you would invite to dinner, dead or alive. Who would they be?
First, Michelle Obama, obviously. Malala. I would love to hear her story firsthand. And Muhammad Yunus. He is the founder of Grameen Bank and kind of one of the leaders of the idea of like bringing social impact and business together. Brilliant mind. So those 3 at a table would be a very interesting conversation.
Yes, that's just a powerful trio right there. Powerful.
Absolutely. Yes.
And final question. 3 words to describe your 2020 year.
I would say growth, challenging, and interesting. In a good way.
In a good way.
In as good of a way as 2020 could be, honestly.
Of course, considering the circumstances, of course.
Right. Yes.
So, Shelby, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. This has been a great conversation. But before you log off, if you could just share with the audience how they can connect with you on social media, and even just share the website for Little Justice Leaders, that'd be awesome, so we can continue to support you.
Yeah. Well, you can find us online pretty much anywhere with Little Justice Leaders. So our website is littlejusticeleaders.com. Instagram, Little Justice Leaders. Same with Facebook. On Twitter, we're at Justice Leaders. But really, if you want to connect with us on social media, Instagram is where we are most active and where you'll get, constant education, tips, support around, bringing social justice into the lives of kids. So littlejusticeleaders.com and Little Justice Leaders on Instagram.
All right, Shelby, thank you again.
Thank you,
Kwame.
Kwame.
To have you.
This has been great. I'm so happy we had this conversation. I feel like we could go on for a long time.
No, we really could have.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll do a part 2, because
I would love that.
There's still a lot that we need to unpack.
There's
but
a lot.
I'm glad that we were able to at least initiate the conversation.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much, Kwame. I appreciate it.
Yes, and you have a good rest of the day.
You too.
All right, much love to your family.
All right, and yours too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And there you have it, people. We have completed another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all streaming platforms. And as always, I'd like to wish you a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace and blessings.